The legendary hero Saitama started as nothing but a joke, a gag character from one chapter of a webcomic, but somehow in this unlikely story, One Punch Man would become one of the most recognizable names in anime history. This is how One Punch Man was made. One Punch Man's creator, alias One, started life like any other Japanese child. Born in Niigata, Japan, and quickly moving to Konosu, Saitama, where he'd then grow up. It was on a trip back to his birthplace Niigata that One initially discovered manga. His grandparents gifted him a volume of Crayon Shin-chan, a funny slice of life that follows a 5-year-old Shin, which One directly credits with his introduction to the manga world. Over time, his enamor with manga would turn into a desire to become a mangaka himself, reading more and more stories as he'd enter middle school. It was here that One would start actively pursuing his artistic and comedic skills, albeit behind closed doors. One admits he didn't want anyone to know his desire to create manga, fearing he'd seem uncool. In fact, he never told a soul. All the other kids were into things like sports or the newest video game, but One was filling up notebooks with manga. This is what he loved. In high school, One had even created his own original manga called Middle-Aged Man, which I'd love to read, but it wasn't all fun and games. His parents found his secret manga, and they weren't happy. This only added fuel to the ashamed of manga flame. He didn't want his parents to be disappointed and didn't want his peers to look down on him. But this didn't stop One. He'd go to fill up 50 whole notebooks with manga by the time he was making Middle-Aged Man, and after high school, his fire would really light up. One was a shy, reclusive kid, comparing himself to his character Mob in Mob Psycho, but that didn't mean he wanted it all in the dark. He had a strong desire to share his work with others, just not those that could judge him. So around 2003, One got himself a Japanese Garake, a camera phone which he intended to share his manga online with other people. He was excited to create manga, but still entered college in another field, just in case. From this point on, One would go to create his own website homepage, posting his manga on it and getting a few views. This process of showing your own hand-drawn photos online in the early 2000s went about the way you'd expect. Blurry images that weren't very readable. As One was leaving high school and entering college, he'd start meeting many aspiring manga artists through his homepage. One of these artists gave him some tips to better the quality of what he was posting. He told One to create palm-sized manga panels in order to keep the image resolution as high as it could, but this obviously couldn't work. One was drawing stick figures in his pictures because a palm's just not large enough for a page of manga. At some point when One entered college, another one of his mangaka friends had won an award, but this time he'd claimed One could be next. Whether it was pressure or expectations, this went to One's head. He immediately started creating an official manga to show the legendary Weekly Shonen Jump. It was a 19-page gag story which One admits was pretty dull. Even as he drew it, he knew what the reaction of the editor would be. Regardless, he created it during his first year at college and showed it to the editorial staff. This interview was far from successful. The editor skimmed through the story very quickly, skipping jokes and not really giving it a fair chance. This experience changed One's direction toward manga in general. It would stoke his flame for creating art, prompting him to upload twice as much as usual, although giving up official manga creation altogether. Most of One's success at this point came from single-image comedic drawings, like characters with huge foreheads or unbelievably large cleft chins. He'd have about 100 site visitors with these kinds of drawings, but still nothing substantial. After years of drawing on paper and uploading to the internet, the same friend who gave One those tips on uploading manga had started drawing on a laptop. He'd recommended One to do the same, so One got a laptop, a tablet, and a manga program called Comic Studio. He'd never drawn digitally, so as a practice chapter, he'd made One Punch Man. A few silly panels about a bald character who always gets mad that he kills things with one punch. One wanted to draw a character in an opposite approach to regular shonen, a bald superhero already at peak strength at chapter 1. The Japanese name Wanpanman was a sort of play on long-running manga Anpanman, which you can probably see the resemblance in. He'd upload 15 pages to Nietzsche rather than his own site, because Nietzsche had many people already on it, posting and reading webcomics every day. The first upload gained more popularity than One had originally anticipated. Realizing he might actually have something, he'd quickly create a second chapter. Comments came flooding in asking about the next chapters, so One sat down and created a plot all the way up to the final chapter, which he says he follows to this day. After 5 chapters, people figured One would be a regular mangaka to the site, and this is when One Punch Man really gained a bit of traction. But after a few months, One had decided to take a hiatus. He claims family matters caused him to leave manga, so from then on, he took a year off and worked as much as he could. But all the while, One's real goal was to save up as much money as possible so he could quit his job and create manga full-time. He wanted to give manga a real shot, 365 days, and if nothing came of it, he'd leave it behind. This year away from manga for one was terrible. He had a nice job, good coworkers, a nice boss, and was making money like he wanted. But he'd been creating and posting manga for years and years, and to not have that outlet for your ideas really hurt him. But it wasn't all bad. During this time, One Punch Man was gaining more traction, so much so that he'd have several people contact him asking to work with him. This is when Yusuke Murata would come into the picture. Yusuke Murata is an illustrator who has decades of experience behind him. In his youth at only 12 years old, he'd created 2 drawings for a Mega Man art contest, both of which he'd win. These concepts he'd draw would become official source material for Mega Man in-game characters. From here, he'd create a large name for himself, drawing many mangas like his first one-shot, Partner, in 1995 at just 17 years old. This manga was published in a special edition of Shueisha's weekly Shonen Jump and landed him the Hop Step Award. From then, his list of works is long and impressive. It wasn't until 2011, in the midst of a difficult project, that Murata had been introduced to One's One Punch Man. He read the entire webcomic overnight, and it's safe to say he liked it. It was exactly the kind of story he'd been trying to work with since the beginning. Murata had known about One Punch Man for a while, but hadn't contacted One for collaboration due to Murata's contract with Weekly Shonen Jump. He felt obligated to draw anything he made for them. Combined with a scary illness and a tweet from One, Murata decided he needed to terminate his contract and fully commit to a collaboration effort. Murata was hospitalized and figured if something were to happen, he at least wanted to spend his last hours working with One. So he sent One a message expressing his desire to work together. The webcomic had over 1 million visits by this time and was growing every day. It was the perfect storm. One wanted to make his One Punch Man remade professionally, and Murata was at a dead end of sorts in his career. His current work he was doing kept running into problems and he was very stressed. One, when contacted by Murata, knew that he was the one he wanted to work with. So they'd meet up and plan a one-shot, something to work with and have to show the publisher. They came up with a few stories, the first of which being titled Earth Monster. One would plan the story and Murata would draw it out. They did this quite a bit, and all the while, One wasn't slowing down with the release of his One Punch Man webcomic. After completing some one-shots and showing them to various publishers, Weekly Young Jump accepted the pair into serialization. Talks of having One redraw the original One Punch Man webcomic arose because One had felt as if he'd improved with regards to digital art. But after a remaster of 2 chapters by One himself, he said it was painfully obvious this new version wouldn't sell. So naturally, Murata took a crack at it with a felt-tip pen and blew One away. After a publisher had been obtained, Murata and One decided on a digital creation of One Punch Man. Murata had never done anything digitally before, so him and his team had the task of relearning how to draw. But to Murata's relief, this way was very nice. Being able to fine-tune his work, unlike in ink drawings, was very refreshing. From then on, he'd practiced drawing digitally and found it to be very fun. He says, quote, "Me and the staff had by then learned the ropes of drawing online and were really into it. I told them that this was the first step in what would be a historic manga. I was drawing in a daze of ecstasy. Now, Murata and One needed to focus on how to convey the original webcomic as a professional manga. Murata had gone through many versions of characters and appearances. He claims he wanted to make Saitama more shonen-like as well. But after a few chapters of a redraw, everything clicked for Murata. He'd struggled particularly hard with Saitama's face and feel, but after seeing this one panel of him, he knew how he needed to look. And with a little effort and thankfully a nice recovery from Murata, the One Punch Man redraw started serialization in June of 2012. Even with all this going on, One had started his now famous manga Mob Psycho, which he published as a manga independently of One Punch Man in April of 2012. He created another webcomic called Makai no Osan a bit before as well. But with all this in motion, things started to take off pretty quick. The One Punch Man webcomic surpassed 8 million visits and the manga became a bestseller really fast. The reception was, needless to say, very positive. On top of all this success, One Punch Man was greenlit for an anime. One says he initially didn't have a reaction because he was so busy, but the next morning it dawned on him that he'd have his own anime. And from then on, the whole thing's history. The One Punch Man manga is at its 29th volume, and One Punch Man's 3rd season may be coming out sometime soon in the future. Animated by none other than Mappa Studio. One Punch Man boasts having one of, if not the highest viewed clip of an anime anywhere on the internet, and has cemented itself into anime history with its unique and hilarious storytelling. All thanks to a guy making a webcomic as a joke.